Zebulun, Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee, and do powerfully command thee, O Spirit. Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee, and do powerfully command.
In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Hello, welcome to the Abracast. I'm your host, John Towers. We're going to be doing something a little bit different tonight. We're going to be talking about a story it's a true story. We're going to be talking about a true story of like 7 dudes a long time ago that got together and created a monster. That is all true. Everything I said is true. We're going to be looking towards the future. I believe we're going to be hearing a lot about the Federal Reserve coming up, especially as, they're talking about, they should have raised the interest rates a long time ago. Anyhow, we're going to be, as they're raising interest rates, we're going to be hearing a lot about the Federal Reserve. So I wanted to get my hands on this book and talk about it and examine the situation. And lo and behold, I was at Buckland's Witchcraft Museum over the Easter holiday. If you guys are around Cleveland or if you're traveling to Cleveland, I strongly recommend hitting up Buckland's museum. Right now you have to schedule times in advance online, but it's great. The guy who runs it has a bunch of awesome stories. There's a bunch of great stuff, things that actually Israel Regardie gave Buckland that originally belonged to Crowley is enshrined in Buckland's. They have this 3-pronged ritual trident there. It's really cool. They hit up my Instagram. I put some provocative pictures on Instagram from Buckland's. But anyhow, their gift shop / bookstore is respectable. They have a H.R. Giger sculpture there. They have, anyhow, all kinds of crazy cool stuff. Like I said, hit up my Instagram. You can see what I saw there. Anyhow, the bookstore / gift shop is respectable, and I bought a lot of books. But one of the books that I was able to find there was The Creature from Jekyll Island. And this is the book we're going to be talking about tonight. So it was a toss-up between Creature from Jekyll Island and Behold the Pale Horse by Milton William Cooper, which I own, quote, own a PDF version of that, and I've used it for the show on multiple occasions, but I have yet to actually run across an actual physical copy of The Creature from Jekyll Island. So I got it, and that's it. We're going to be talking about it, and this is why we're going to be talking about it. So here I am recording from this little island off the coast of Georgia, and I have my vessel of the art jam-packed, filled to the brim with my formula for weapon of mass distraction, my Jin Jihad. And I was trying to think if there was a tarot card that I would sort of assign to this evening's show. What would it be? And of course, it's fairly obvious. It would be the Six of Coins inverted. Dun, dun, dun. So if you're interested in the Vessel of the Art or my set of tarot cards, you can check out Abracast.com. Go to the storefront. Even if you just want to check out the designs for the tarot cards, they're there. They're without a watermark. Do whatever the fuck you want with them. So let's get into this. So it's going to be a little bit different. Usually when I tackle books, usually I try to get them cover to cover, do them all, but also, generally speaking, there have been some, I'm not going to admit this if law enforcement's asking me, but they're generally speaking in the public domain. This book, however, is not in the public domain, but I'm not going to be doing this whole book. We're going to be snatching and grabbing through it. It is a giant book. It's like a fucking cinder block of a book. So I don't really have my hands or my brain wrapped around how many episodes we're going to be spending on this, but I definitely wanted to get into it. And some people out there are like, what are you talking about? The Federal Reserve. What do you mean a group of guys went to this island off the coast of Georgia and created the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve is like the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is like FedEx, meaning it has the word federal in the title. A lot of you guys out there probably know this or whatever, but we're going to get into it. I'm going to steer away from sovereign citizen debates and all of this sort of stuff you wind up getting into when you try to have a discussion with conspiracy people about the Federal Reserve. But when we look at conspiracies here on the show, what do we look at? We look at conspiracies that happen in real world life that are right out in front of our faces that just no one pays attention to. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, we'll just send everyone a mail-in ballot. That's not going to be difficult to validate at all. It's more a commentary on the media or on academia, what academia steers away from, what the media steers away from, etc. However, I wanted to get us a foothold into the Fed because I believe that it's going to become a hot topic here in the not too distant future. The Journey to Jekyll Island. This book is written by a guy named G. Edward Griffin. The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve. There's all sorts of accolades from a bunch of people with big brains. More accomplished jobs than I have that endorse this book. And all this stuff. So here we go. We're going to get into enough of me babbling about it. Let's go. The Journey to Jekyll Island. The New Jersey railway station was bitterly cold that night. Flurries of the year's first snow swirled around street lights. November wind rattled roof panels above the track shed and gave a long, mournful sound among the rafters. It was approaching 10 p.m., and the station was nearly empty except for a few passengers scurrying to board the last southbound of the day. The rail equipment was typical for that year, the year of our Lord, 1910. Mostly chair cars converted into sleepers with cramped upper and lower berths for those with limited funds. Coach cars were coupled to the front. They would make the brunt of the engine's noise and smoke that somehow always managed to seep through unseen cracks. A dining car was placed between the sections of a subtle barrier between the two classes of travelers. By today's standards, the environment was drab. Chairs and mattresses were hard, surfaces were metal or scarred wood, colors were dark green and gray. In their hurry to board the train, to escape the chill of the wind, few passengers noticed the activity at the far end of the platform. At a gate seldom used at this hour of the night was a spectacular sight. Nudged against the end rail bumper was a long car that caused those few who saw it to stop and stare. Its gleaming black paint was accented with polished brass handrails, knob frames, and filigrees. The shades were drawn, but through the open door one could see a mahogany paneling, velvet drapes, plushed armchairs in a well-stocked bar. Porters with white serving coats were busying themselves with routine chores, and there was a faint and distant aroma of expensive cigars. Other cars in the station bore numbers on the end, each to distinguish them from their dull brothers. But numbers were not needed for this beauty. One word centered on each side of the small plaque bearing but a single word: Aldrich. The name Nelson Aldrich, senator from Rhode Island, was well known even in Jersey. By the year of our Lord, 1910, he was one of the most powerful men in Washington, D.C., and his private railway car was often seen at the New York and New Jersey rail terminals during frequent trips to Wall Street. Aldrich was far more than a senator. He was considered to be the political spokesman for big business. As an investment associate of J.P. Morgan, he had extensive holdings in the bank, manufacturing, and public utilities. His son-in-law was John D. Rockefeller Jr. 60 years later, his grandson, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, would become vice president of the United States. When Aldrich arrived at the station, there was no doubt that he was the commander of the private car, wearing a long fur-collared coat, a silk top hat, and carrying a silver-tipped walking stick, even. He strode briskly down the platform with his secretary, Sheldon, and a cluster of porters behind them, hauling assorted trunks and cases. No sooner had the senator boarded his car when several more passengers arrived with similar collections of luggage. The last man appeared just more moments before the final "All aboard!" He was carrying a shotgun case. While Aldrich was easily recognized by most of the travelers who saw him walk through the station, the number of faces were not familiar. These strangers had been instructed to arrive separately to avoid reporters, and should they meet inside the station, to act as though they did not know each other after boarding the train. They had been told to use first names only, so as not to accidentally reveal each other's identity. As a result of these elaborate precautions, not even the private car porters and servants knew the names of these guests. Back at the main gate, there was a double blast from the engine's whistle. Suddenly, the general sensation of the motions of excitement of a journey begun. But no sooner had the train cleared the platform when it shuddered to a stop. Then, to everyone's surprise, it reversed directions and began moving towards the station again. Had they forgotten something? Was there a problem with the engine? A sudden lurch and slam of couplers gave the answer. They had picked up another car at the end of the train, possibly the mail car. In an instant, the forward motion then resumed, and all thoughts returned to the trip ahead, to the minimal comforts of the accommodations. And so, as the passengers drifted off to sleep that night, the rhythmic clicking of steel wheels against the rail, little did they dream that riding in the car at the end of their train were 7 men who represented the estimated 1/4 of the total wealth of the entire world. This was the roster of the Aldrich car that night. Nelson W. Aldrich, Republican, whip in the Senate, chairman of the National Monetary Commission, business associate of J.P. Morgan, father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller Jr., Abraham Piet Andrew, assistant secretary of the United States Treasury, Frank A. Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York, the most powerful of the banks at the time, representing William Rockefeller and the international investment banking house Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Henry P. Davison, senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Chucky D. Norton, president of J.P. Morgan's First National Bank of New York. Benjamin Strong, head of the J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. And Paul M. Warburg, the partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company, a representative of the Rothschilds banking dynasty in England and France, and brother to Max Warburg, who was the head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. The centralization of control over financial resources was far advanced by 1910. The United States, there were 2 main focal points of this control. Can you guess it? The Morgan Group and the Rockefeller Group. Within each orbit was an intricate maze of commercial banks, acceptance banks, investment firms in Europe. The same process of financial concentration has proceeded even further, had coalesced into the Rothschilds Group and the Warburg Group. An article appeared in the New York Times on May 3rd in 1931 commenting on the death of George Baker, one of J.P. Morgan's closest associates. And it said 1/6 of the total wealth of the world was represented by members of the Jekyll Island Club. The reference was to just those men who were part of the Morgan Group. Members of the Jekyll Island Club. It did not include the Rockefeller Group or the European financiers. When all these were combined, the previous estimate was that 1/4 of the wealth of the world was represented by these groups is particularly conservative. In 1913, the same year, the Federal Reserve Act was passed into law. A subcommittee of the House Committee on Currency and Banking under the chairmanship of Arsène Pujol of Louisiana completed its investigation into the concentration of financial powers of the United States. Pujol was considered to be the spokesman of the oil interests. Part of the very group under the investigation did everything possible to sabotage the hearings. In spite of his efforts, however, the final report of the committee at large was devastating. And it said, your committee is satisfied from the proof submitted, even in the absence of data from the banks, that there is an established and well-defined identity and community of interest between a few leaders of finance, which has resulted in a great and rapidly growing concentration of the control of money and credit in the hands of these few men. Under our system of issuing and distributing corporate securities and investing, public does not buy directly from the corporation. The securities travel from the issuing house through middlemen to the investor, and it is only the great banks or bankers with access to the mainsprings of the concentrated resource made up of other people's money in the banks, in the trust companies, and the life insurance companies, and with the control of the machinery for creating markets and distributing securities, who have had the power to underwrite or guarantee the sales of large-scale security issues. The men who, through their control over these funds of our railroads and our industrial companies, are able to direct where such funds shall be kept, and thus to create these great reservoirs of the people's money. They are the ones in position to tap those reservoirs for the ventures in which they are interested, and to prevent their being tapped for purposes which they do not approve. The latter is quite important, a factor, and the former controlling consideration in its effect on the competition in the railroad and the industrial world. The fucking industrial world. Do you hear? Hey boy, do you hear what I'm saying? I'm talking to you. I'm trying to teach you something. So this reminds me of like all the stuff we're hearing about BlackRock and all this stuff nowadays. You know, they have that beauty of a video clip of, I think the guy's name is Pincus or Pinkerton or something. He's like the boss of BlackRock. He had like an office in the White House. He was like one of the big things, but he was doing this interview or this speech when he was like, you know, really we're kind of in the business of forcing behaviors. So for someone who controls a ton of money, what does forcing behaviors mean? It doesn't mean like social engineering through legislation, which is what we see with like Bill Clinton and those guys, right? Like we're, you know, forcing behavior. This is the ESG score stuff. Like they literally mean forcing behavior. You're not going to be able to do business unless you do X, Y, and Z. All right, so where are we at? Oh yeah. They're controlling the consideration and its effects on competition in the railroad and also, P.S., the industrial world. So we consider also in this connection that into these reservoirs of money, the credit line flow a large part of the reserves of the bank and of the country, and that they also, those agents and correspondents of the out-of-town banks and the loaning of their surplus funds, and the only public money market of the country, and that a small group of men and their partners and associates have now further strengthened their hold upon the resources of these institutions by acquiring large stock holdings therein, by representation of their boards, and through valuable patronage. We begin to realize that something of the extent to which the practical and effective domination and control over our greatest financial, railroad, and industrial corporations have developed largely within the past 5 years, and that it is fraught with peril to the welfare of the country. Such was the nature of the wealth and power represented in those 7 men who gathered in secret that night and traveled to the luxury of Senator Aldrich's private car. So BlackRock has been revealed to be the owner of, not the owner, but they own a lot of Twitter. So when Mr. Musk made his bid and everyone freaked I guess they're still freaking the fuck out. I guess if you knew how to do it, you could search the shareholders of Twitter and you find out that actually BlackRock owns a lot of Twitter. You're like, why does BlackRock own a lot of Twitter? I don't think Twitter makes any money. You know what I mean? Like, it's all about, it's like Netflix. It's like Netflix. I don't think, or YouTube. Like, these things don't make money. They're just around to message to you. That's just my opinion. I'm not a financier. I'm not a financial analyst. That's not where my doctorate is. As the train neared the destination of Raleigh, North Carolina, the following afternoon, it slowed and then stopped in the switching yard, and just before the station terminal. Quickly, the track crew threw a switch and the engine smoothly backed the last car into an empty sitting where just quickly the uncoupled and left behind. The passengers stepped into the platform at the terminal a few moments later. The train appeared exactly as it had been when they boarded, and they could not know that their traveling companions for the night, at that very instant, were joining still another train, which within the hour would depart southbound once again. The elite group of financiers was embarked on a 1,000-mile journey that led them to Atlanta, then to Savannah, and then finally to a small town of Brunswick, Georgia. At first, it would seem that Brunswick was an unlikely destination, located in the Atlantic seaboard. It was primarily a fishing village, with a small but lively port for cotton and lumber, and its population is only a few thousand people. But by the time the sea islands that sheltered the coast from South Carolina to Florida had already become popular as winter resorts for the very wealthy. One such island, just off the coast of Brunswick, had recently been purchased by J.P. Morgan and several of his business associates. And it was here that they came in the fall and winter to hunt ducks or deer and to escape the rigors of cold weather in the north. And it was called Jekyll Island. When the Aldrich car uncoupled under the siding, I don't know what this is, and the small Brunswick station, it was indeed conspicuous. The word traveled quickly to the office of the town's weekly newspaper. While the group was waiting to be transferred to the dock, several people from the newspaper approached and began asking questions. Who were Aldrich's guests? Why were they here? Was there anything special happening? Mr. Davison, who was one of the owners of Jekyll Island and who was well known to the local newspaper, told him that these were merely personal friends and they had come for a simple amusement of duck hunting. Satisfied that there was no real news in the event, the reporters returned to their office. Even after the arrival of the remote island lodge, the secretary continued for 9 days to rule, for the first names only remained in effect. Full-time caretakers and servants had been given vacation. An entirely new, carefully screened staff was brought in for the occasion. This was done to make absolutely sure that none of the servants might recognize by the sight the identities of these guests. It is difficult to imagine any event in history, including the preparation for war, that was shielded from public view with greater mystery and secrecy. The purpose of this meeting on Jekyll Island was not to hunt ducks. Sorry, I have my pen here. I'm keeping... The purpose of this meeting on Jekyll Island was not to hunt ducks. Simply stated, it was to come to an agreement on the structure and operation of a banking cartel. The goal of the cartel, as is true with all of them, was to maximize profits by minimizing competition between members, to make it difficult for new competitors to enter the field, to utilize the police power of the government to enforce the cartel agreement. In more specific terms, the purpose and indeed the actual outcome of this meeting was to create the blueprint of the Federal Reserve System. For many years after this event, educators, commentators, historians denied that the Jekyll Island meeting ever took place. Even now, the accepted view is that this meeting was relatively unimportant, and only unparanoid, unsophisticates would try to make anything out of it. Ron Chernow writes, the Jekyll Island meeting could be the fountain of 1,000 conspiracy theories. Little by little, however, the story has been pieced together in amazing detail, and it has come directly or indirectly from those who were actually there. Furthermore, if what they say about their own purposes and actions does not constitute a classic conspiracy, then there's little meaning to that word. The first leak regarding this meeting found its way into print in 1916, which was only 6 years later. It appeared in Leslie's Weekly and was written by a young financial reporter by the name of B.C. Forbes, who later founded Forbes magazine. The article was primarily in praise of Paul Warburg, And it was likely that Warburg let the story out during conversations with the writer. At any rate, the opening paragraph contained the dramatic but highly accurate summary of both the nature and the purpose of the meeting. And it reads, picture a party of the nation's greatest bankers stealing out of New York on a private railroad car under the cover of darkness, stealthily hieing hundreds of miles south, embarking on a mysterious launch, sneaking out into an island deserted by all but a few servants, living there a full week under rigid security, and that the names of not one of them was mentioned, lest the servants learn the identity and disclose to the world the strangest, most secret expedition in the history of American finance. I am not romanticizing. I am giving the world for the first time the real story of the famous Aldrich currency report. The foundation of our new currency system was written. 1930, Paul Warburg wrote a massive book, 1,750 pages in all, entitled The Federal Reserve System, Its Origin and Its Growth. This is in this tome, he described the meeting and its purpose, but did not mention either its location or the names of those attended. But he did say, quote, the results of the conference were entirely confidential. Even the fact that there had been a meeting was not permitted to become public, unquote. Then in a footnote, he added, quote, though 18 years have since gone by, I do not feel free to give a description of this most interesting conference concerning which Senator Aldrich pledged all participants to secrecy, unquote. An interesting insight to Paul Warburg's attendance at the Jekyll Island meeting came 34 years later in a book written by his son, James. James had been appointed by FDR as director of the budget and during World War II as the head of the Office of War Information. In his book, he described how his father, who didn't know one end of a gun to another, borrowed a shotgun from a friend and carried it with him to the train to disguise himself as a duck hunter. This part of the story was corroborated in the official biography of Senator Aldrich written by Nathaniel Wright Stevenson. In the autumn of 1910, 6 men, in addition to Aldrich, went out to shoot ducks. That is to say, they told the world that was their purpose. Mr. Wahlberg, who was of the number, gave an amusing account of his feelings when he boarded the private car in Jersey City, bringing him with all the accoutrements of a duck shooter. The joke was, in fact, that he had never shot a duck in his life, and had no interest in shooting any. The duck shoot was a blind. Stevenson continued his description in the encounter with the Brunswick station, and he tells us that shortly after they arrived, the station master walked to their private car and shocked them by his apparent knowledge of their identities, the identities of everyone who were aboard. To make matters worse, he said that the group of reporters were waiting outside. Davison took charge. "Come outside, old man," he said, "and I will tell you a story." No one claims to know what the story was told standing in the railroad ties that morning, but a few moments later, Davison returned on board with a smile on his face, and he says, "It's all right. It's all right." He said reassuringly, "They won't give us away." Stevenson continues, the rest is silence. The reporters dispersed, and the secret of the strange journey was not divulged. No one asked him how he managed it, and he did not volunteer the information. That February 9th, 1935, issues of the Saturday Evening Post, an article appeared written by Frank Vanderlip, and in it he said, "Despite my views about the value to society of greater publicity for the affairs of corporations, there was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was secretive indeed, as furtive as any conspirator. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion, the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. We were told to leave our last names behind us. We were told further that we should avoid dining together on the night of our departure. We were instructed to come one at a time as unobtrusively as possible to the railroad terminal in New Jersey, littoral of Hudson, where Senator Aldrich's private car would be in readiness attached to the rear end of the train for the South. Once aboard the private car, we began to observe the taboo that had been fixed on last names. We addressed each other as Ben, Paul, Nelson, Abe. It is Abraham, Piet, Andrew. Davison and I adopted the deeper disguises, abandoning our first names on the theory that we were always right. He became Wilbur and I became Orville after those two aviation pioneers. Yeah, Wilbur and Orville. The Wright brothers. The servants on the train crew may have known the identities of one or two of us, but they did not know us all. And it was the names of all printed together that would have made our mysterious journey significant in Washington, in Wall Street, even in London. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted. If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had gotten together and written a banking bill that would have been no chance whatsoever of passage by Congress. The composition of Jekyll Island meeting was a classic example of a cartel structure. The cartel is a group of independent businesses which join together to coordinate the production, pricing, or marketing of their members. The purpose of the cartel is to reduce competition and thereby increase profitability. This is accomplished through a shared monopoly over the industry, which forces the public to pay higher prices for their goods or services that would be otherwise required under free enterprise competition. They're representatives of the world's leading bank consortia: Morgan, Rockefeller, Rothschilds, Warburgs, and Kuhn Loeb. They were often competitors, and there was little doubt that was considerable distrust between them and skillful maneuvering for favored position in any agreement. But they were driven together by one overriding desire to fight the common enemy, and that enemy was competition. In 1910, the numbers of banks in the United States was growing at a phenomenal rate. In fact, it had more than doubled to over 20,000 in just the previous 10 years. Furthermore, most of them were springing up in the South and West, causing New York banks to suffer a steady decline of market share. Almost all banks in the 1880s were national banks, which means that they were chartered by the federal government. Generally, they were located in big cities and were allowed by law to issue their own currency in the form of bank notes. Even as early as 1896, however, the number of non-national banks had grown to 61%, and they already held 54% of the country's total banking deposits. By 1913, when the Federal Reserve Act was passed, those numbers were 71% non-national bank holding 57% of deposits. The eyes of those duck hunters from New York. This was a trend that simply had to be reversed. Competition was also coming from a new trend in industry to finance future growth out of profits rather than from borrowed capital. This was the outgrowth of free market interest rates, which set a realistic balance between debt and thrift. Rates were low enough to attract serious borrowers who were confident the success of their business ventures and their ability to repay, but they were high enough to discourage loans for frivolous ventures from those which were alternative sources of funding. For example, one's own capital. The balance between debt and thrift was the result of limited money supply. Banks banks could create loans in excess of their actual deposits, as we shall see, but there was a limit to that process, and that limit was ultimately determined by a supply of gold they held. Consequently, between 1900 and 1910, 70% of the funding for American corporate growth was generated internally, making industry increasingly independent of banks. Even the federal government was becoming thrifty. It had growing stockpiles of gold, was systematically redeeming the greenbacks which had been issued during the Civil War, and was rapidly reducing the national debt. Here was another trend that had to be halted. When the bankers wanted, and what many businessmen wanted also, was to intervene in the free market and to tip the balance of the interest rates downwards to favor debt over thrift. Boy, howdy, did they fucking do it. To accomplish this, the money supply simply had to be disconnected from gold and made more plentiful, or, as they described, more elastic. The greatest threat, however, came from rivals of private capital formations, but from the public at large in the form of what bankers call run on the bank. This is why you should have some of your money stuffed under your mattress right now, because there's going to be a run on the bank when everyone figures out what the fuck's happening. This is because when banks accept a customer's deposit, they gave them a return balance in their account. This is equivalent to a promise to pay back the deposit anytime he wants. Likewise, when another customer borrows money from the bank, he is also given an account balance, which usually is withdrawn immediately to satisfy the purpose of the loan. This creates a ticking time bomb, because at this point the bank has issued more promises to pay on demand than it has money in the vault, even though the depositing customer thinks he can get his money anytime he wants. In reality, it has been given to the borrowing customer and is no longer available at the bank. The problem is compounded further by the fact that the banks are allowed to loan even more money than they have received in deposit. The mechanism for accomplishing this seemingly impossible feat will be described in later blah blah blah. But as a fact of modern banking that promises to pay often exceeds savings deposits by a factor of 10 to 1. And because only about 3% of these accounts actually retained in the vault in the form of cash, the rest having been put into even more loans and investments, the bank's promises exceed its ability to keep those promises by a factor of over 300 to 1. As long as only a small percentage of the depositors request their money at one time, no one is the wiser. But if public confidence is shaken, and if more than a few percent attempts to withdraw their funds, the scheme is finally exposed. The bank cannot keep all of its promises. It is forced to close its doors. Bankruptcy usually follows in due course. The same result could happen, and prior to the Federal Reserve System, often did happen, even with depositors making a run on the bank. Instead of withdrawing their funds at the teller's windows, they simply wrote checks to purchase goods or services, and people received those checks, took them to the bank for the deposit, and if the bank happened to be the same one from which the check was drawn, then all was well, because it was not necessary to remove any real money from the vault. If the holder of the check took it to another bank, it was quickly passed back to the issuing bank, and settlement was determined between the banks. This was not a one-way street, however. While downtown Downtown Bank is demanding payment from Uptown Bank. The Uptown Bank is also clearing checks and demanding payment from the Downtown Bank. As long as the money flow in both directions is equal, then everything can be handled with simple bookkeeping. But if the flow is not equal, then one of the banks will have to actually send money to the other to make up the difference. This is amount of money actually required actually exceeds a few percentage points of the bank's total deposit. The result is the same as a run on the bank by the depositors. This demand in money in other banks rather than by the depositors is called currency drain. In 1910, the most common cause of a bank having to declare bankruptcy is due to currency drain. Was that it followed a loan policy that was more reckless than that of its competitors. More money was demanded from it because more money was loaned by it. It was dangerous enough for the loan 90% of their customers' savings, keeping only $1 in reserve out of every 10. But it had proven to be inadequate most of the time because banks, however they were tempted to walk even closer to the precipice, they pushed the ratio to 92%, 95%, 99%. After all, the way a bank makes money is to collect interest. And the only way to do that is to make loans. The more loans, the better. And so there was a practice among some of the more reckless banks to loan up, as they call it, which was another way of saying to push down the reserve ratios. All right, we're going to end here for the evening. I'm John. This is the Abracast. Check out Abracast.com. We don't really have anything like that. I'm going to have to create a new... I think I'm going to have to create a new thing. I don't know. We'll see what happens with the feature topic. Anyhow, I'll let Hill tell you everything else. Thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed this, and there's going to be certainly more to come, as I think that this is going to be an important topic looking, forward to our impending doom.
Thank you for listening, and we hope that you enjoyed the show. Please send an email or find us on social media and let us know what you think about the show. We would appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rate and review wherever you find your favorite podcasts. You can find Stigmata Studios, graphic, novels, and comic books. Take control of your destiny. Understand your past. Put your present in context and know your future with a twist. Check out the Abracast Tarot Card Deck. Your body is your temple. So let's make sure you got a badass t-shirt on it. Variety of cool occult themed t-shirts. And other merch like stickers, wall art, mugs, and more. Welcome to the Red Archive. Get access to over 50 hours of archived episodes. More bonus audio. Additional exclusive content. All this for only $1 a month. Are you interested in the occult, history, conspiracy, and violence? Learn more at Abracast.com.